For months now, France has been rocked by the widely controversial Yellow Vests protests. But there's far more to these protests than what meets the eye. What many thought to be a simple protest movement has continued for months, as the true demands of the Yellow Vests have become more apparent. The movement started in October 2017, with an online petition which received over 300,000 signatures. This overwhelming support transformed into a real demonstrative protest on November 17th. Thousands of French protesters took to the streets, dressed in yellow reflective jackets. This was in reference to the reflective jackets that French citizens were required to have in their cars. As frustration built, so did the Yellow Vests' actions, with some resorting to violence by burning cars, looting stores, and having clashes with the police. The main reason for their rage was the government's job of raising fuel prices. Since the beginning of 2017, the fuel price has risen about 20% at that time. This was excluding the government's plan for further tax increases, which would increase fuel prices. Some of them were also unhappy with the country's immigrant policies and say President Macron has sold the country out by agreeing to a non-bidding United Nations pact on immigration. Clearly, these people had reason to be mad. It has, though, become apparent that the protesters' frustration stems from many other places as well. The protesters mainly consisted of blue-collared workers who felt traditionally under and misrepresented. They feel they had been cast aside by the government and left to fend for themselves. A lack of opportunities and attention from the government has left the communities impoverished. Their rage is also directed specifically at French President Emmanuel Macron and the political system which gives him so much power. They despise his lack of communication with his citizens and say he is totally disconnected from his people. What they want is for him to really care about their difficulty and show understanding on an emotional level. The protesters are calling on him to end the social inequalities of the last decades. This was indeed one of President Macron's campaign promises when running for president. So what happened? Was it simply a lie Macron told to gain support of low-income workers, or had he quite simply put, just not gotten around to it yet? Keep in mind that he was only elected earlier that year in May. That didn't exactly give him a lot of time to attack such an enormous issue. The government's response to the protests have been rather negative. Although President Macron promised during his campaign that he would not bow to mass protests, he was forced to swallow his pride and shelve the fuel tax increase plan in an attempt to calm the crowds. Sadly, his attempt was futile, as the protesters' rage had far superseded mere fuel prices. The government are retaliating against the violent aspects of the protests in an orderly fashion. In France, a demonstration has to be declared and authorized by municipal authorities at least 3 days before the planned protest. They have proposed new legislation which would cause protesters who wear masks or cover their face to be jailed. Authorities have been able to fine mask-wearing protesters when they infringe on public order. This has not stopped some protesters. At the moment, the crime is only a minor offence and punishable with a fine. We have to preserve the freedom to protest in France and punish those who want to violate this right, said Prime Minister Edouard Philippe. Philippe also said that the law would result in troublemakers having to pay property damages, not innocent taxpayers. It's claimed that the reason for the government's poor negotiation with the movement is that it does not have very clear demands or leaders. This is only one way to look at it, and it can also be seen as another example of President Macron being disconnected from the lower income class of his country. So disconnected, in fact, that he doesn't even understand how to appeal to them in the slightest for the sake of national peace. Although the government has a somewhat combative attitude towards the movement, there are some who support the movement. After all, what better opportunity is there for a political candidate opposing President Macron to gain support? Enters Mayor Steve Broich. Wanting to affirm his support for the movement, he has put a sign up at the entrance of his town acclaiming their support for the Yellow Vests. He also allowed protesters to gather around wood fires in a municipal parking lot and march along a main road which defied a ban issued by regional authorities under President Macron. His actions could be seen as somewhat suspect, considering his lifelong rally against disorder and his sudden change of heart. Critics are calling him out, saying he was supposed to be Mr. Security, the new sheriff in town. The hypocrisy of his support for this movement is ludicrous. Another politician trying to capitalize on the events is one Marine Le Pen, the candidate for the newly named Rassemblement National, a political party opposing President Macron. Jean Yves, director of the Observatory of Radical Politics at the Jean Jaurès Foundation, said Ms. Le Pen's party was best positioned on the political spectrum to co-opt the Yellow Vests. She too has made her support of the protests clear and has encouraged her supporters and officials to join the crowds and fight against President Macron's policies of helping only the rich. In an interview with La Parisien newspaper, Ms. Le Pen mocked President Macron's plans to increase fuel taxes to raise money for eco-friendly projects. This plan has since been revoked. She said this was yet another example of the so-called Paris elite, sealed off in their own happy world with no connection to what is happening to the rest of the country, and yet having the job of running it. While this might seem like a great opportunity for the Rassemblement National to gain support, they are wielding a double-edged sword. While they are hoping to gain the votes of the Yellow Vests in the next election, polls suggest that they might lose a very significant amount of votes if the Yellow Vests put forth their own candidate. The Yellow Vests say they are a movement that stands against all political parties, including Ms. Le Pen's Rassemblement National. After 4 weeks of radio silence from the president, he finally addressed the nation on the crisis and met with trade unionists and business leaders in search of a solution. Marine Le Pen is calling on him to recognize society's suffering and deliver immediate, very strong response. The French finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, said the weeks of protests have been an economic nightmare and have caused chaos on the roads and put off shoppers in the run-up to Christmas. We can only speculate about the West's plan to potentially put forth a candidate, but one thing is certain. If they want to make a true difference and succeed in reshaping France, they'll have to become more organized, with clear leadership, demands and plans for the future. This will both help them to be taken more seriously and not to run out of supporters who lose interest after the excitement of the moment has worn off. I would like to thank everyone for watching. If you found this video interesting, remember to subscribe and share it with your friends. If you have any specific topic you want me to cover in future episodes, please leave a comment.